Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, fellow students and other listeners. I suppose it's already been done so perhaps I risk redundancy in doing this, but I will take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Teofolo, and I'm representing Northampton Community College. I come before you today to speak with regards to the lie that is the American meritocracy, as evidenced, I believe, by imbalances in political and elite spheres, particularly with respect to the underrepresentation of women in said spheres. As I have taken a women and gender studies course, I therefore would like to do my best to represent their experience to the extent that I can. However, due consideration should and must be paid to other historically and presently socially disadvantaged populations, but the specifics of their experiences largely extend beyond the parameters of these remarks. I would like to speak as to my thoughts on possible downstream consequences of the disparities in the influential spheres, as Afro said, of today, and the associated divisions, as in unfair divisions of labor and also psychological divisions between people, which I would argue could be a concomitant of that. I would also like to speak as to what I think broader implications could be of this inconsistency, which I speak of, between the edifice which our society is said to be predicated upon and is supposed to be living up to in actuality, and the reality of life in America for too many of our citizens. America is popularly regarded as the quintessential meritocracy. I mean, just think of the American dream. Conceive it, take steps towards achieving it, and you will be able to obtain your objective. I mean, everybody loves a good rags to riches story, right? But unfortunately, as I do believe I'll be able to demonstrate herein, the glass ceiling is still present in our society, one molded from gender stereotypes specifically, but stereotypes in their other forms should be considered as well, and which then manifest as gender discrimination. And as long as we are unwilling or perhaps unable to be attuned to these flaws in our system, which result in the systematic exclusion of proportions of our population from spheres of influence, allowing individuals to achieve self-actualization, we cannot unify in our attempts to address the flaws in our American system. And as the word unify implies, it takes all of us to be able to move towards a better and more inclusive future. With that being said, I'd like to provide you with what I believe is a functional definition of the term meritocracy derived from Oxford dictionaries, which I would respectfully suggest you refer back to as I proceed with my remarks, and I'm quoting it roughly verbatim here. A meritocracy is a political or social system, a system of governance in which individuals are able to be in positions which are in proportion to their merit, demonstrated aptitudes and talents. So in any domain in such a society in which a certain degree of merit is required for upwards hierarchical progression, decisions regarding competence could be made on basis of what an individual is capable of or not capable of, but not on basis of who they are. Any decisions regarding competence which are made on basis of perceptions of an individual constitutes a taint on any system which purportedly has meritocratic elements, and in my opinion, should be treated with the utmost degree of seriousness. Now, this idea of the meritocracy has been incorporated into high-level political discourse really since the days of the ancient Greeks, and in its purest form, unadulterated by archaic perceptions of competence, formed on broad generalizations and in complete ignorance to the reality of the human existence, which is that there is tremendous individual variation which exists within groups. It sounds rather good, at least in my opinion. It sounds fair, but unfortunately, it is not being applied. And as a rather inquisitive person myself, perhaps hence the reason why I'm speaking with you today, I came to ask the question of why, and I don't pretend as a second-year college student that I'm even close to having all of this figured out. I most definitely do not, but there are some conclusions which I've arrived at, which I believe are encapsulated in one particular quote, which I would like to provide for you today by a Thomas Sowell, economist, and I'm quoting him roughly verbatim here. He states that the only color that capitalism sees is green. Therefore, all else must be subservient to it. Hence, race, ethnicity, class cannot be considered within it. And in my opinion, this sort of a mindset is marked by a certain American exceptionalism. This idea that our society is special and therefore inherently good. And because we have an inherently good society, there can be no bad which exists within it. And also a certain kind of wishful thinking. This is just my interpretation of the mindset, just to make that absolutely clear. The wishful thinking being that people want to believe so badly that the ideals which our society is said to be predicated upon are being lived up to in actuality, that it results in individuals not being attuned to the discrimination, the stereotypes, specifically the glass ceiling, that does in fact exist in our system. And as long as we are not willing to come to the realization that there exist flaws in our system of this nature, we cannot address them. So With that being said, I'd like to provide you with a historical example of gender discrimination in the workplace, which I believe is a perfect exemplification of that which I'm talking about here, being that we have a certain inconsistency between reality and purported reality. And as you can see from my slide here, it is the case of the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Academically gifted, and in accordance with her gifts, she finds herself Ivy League educated, graduating from Cornell in 1954 at the top of her class, before moving on to Harvard Law School, where she becomes the president of the Harvard Law Review Board. Out of a class of 500 students, she's one of 9 women. And it's important to acknowledge that academia at this point in time was rather overtly hostile to women. Women were explicitly discouraged from entering into law school. Justice Ginsburg herself, to my understanding, was actually the subject of ire in her time at Harvard Law School, because individuals believed that she was taking up a seat that was supposed to be reserved for males. They weren't assessing her on basis of her demonstrated competence, but they were assessing her on basis of their schemas of women. She then moves on to Columbia Law School to complete her legal studies, where she graduates at the top of her class in 1959. Now, she graduates 2 top-tier institutions, not once, but twice at the top of her class. One would therefore think that it would be hard-pressed to find an individual of more talent, of more brilliance, of more merit than she was able to demonstrate. And if we do, in fact, live in a meritocratic society, one would think that she would be able to find herself in a position of the highest degree of influence and the highest degree of status. Now, we do have to consider that she was fresh out of college, but you would at least be able to think that she would be able to work, because who's more qualified than somebody who graduates from Cornell and Columbia Law School at the top of her class? Again, 2 top-tier institutions at the top of her class. But this was not the reality for Justice Ginsburg, unfortunately. She actually struggled to even find a job. It was not until a former professor of hers from Columbia Law School approached a prospective employer of hers by the name of Justice Edmund Palmieri, and essentially stated that he would not be sending any further students of his to him for employment if he did not employ Justice Ginsburg. And then she's employed as a legal clerk, embarking on the illustrious career that we all know her for, a career in which she attempted to dispel with gender discrimination in our society. Now, we have to, I think, consider what could have happened had she not had that professor of hers. Well, it could have been the case that she could have found a job anyways. But for the sake of discussion, and I think in alignment with reality, we have to consider the fact that she may not have been able to do so had he not advocated on her behalf. And what did she do in her life? Well, the breadth of her accomplishments are just too broad for me to get into specifics about at this time, but let's consider the nature of her position for a moment. The judicial branch of government, I consider it an elite sphere. By nature of that position, they have the ability to set a precedent, which then can set, of course, the example for future actions or inactions. And over time, the society is molded in accordance with the perspective of that individual. I mean, let's just think of a few things that she did. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, Ledbetter versus Goodyear, which led to the Fair Pay Act of 2009, United States versus Virginia in 1996. If she had not been able to apply her gifts, apply her talents, achieving self-actualization as a concomitant of that, we would have perhaps even less equality of opportunity than we do at present. And it would have been because of the glass ceiling. It would have been because of gender discrimination. Now, I think we also have to ask the question of how many other women in particular are out there at present, have been out there throughout history, of similar levels of brilliance to Justice Ginsburg, having similar talents, individuals who really have something to offer to our society in any domain and in any manner, but because of the glass ceiling, because of gender discrimination, because of gender stereotypes, they are not being allowed to apply their gifts for the betterment of themselves and the betterment of society. And ultimately, I think we have to basically admit that as a society, we're only harming ourselves. We're depriving ourselves of vital human resources, human capital that, when applied, could increase the likelihood that we continue to function at a high level into the future. So with that being said, I would now like to proceed with providing you some statistics pertaining to the political sphere of today. Now, 51% of our population is comprised of women, yet 27% of the United States Congress, 24% of the United States Senate, 27% of the United States House of Representatives, 0% of our presidents, 30% of statewide elected executives of any kind, 31% of mayors in our country's largest cities, and 25% of mayors in cities with populations of over 30,000 people are women. Now, the disparities are present. I provided you with the statistics, but they don't really tell us enough. So please allow me to supplement this with some analysis here. Let's consider the nature of the political sphere. Again, individuals within those spheres, of course, wield inordinate power relative to the average person. They have the ability to mold the culture in accordance with their perspective. So now let's talk about the underrepresentation of a significant, really majority of our population in said spheres. Individuals with experience, true real world experience with the glass ceiling, discrimination in its various forms, particularly gender discrimination. Now, I think you would agree with me when I say that personality and identity manifest in one's work, because what are we if not the sum total of all of our personality traits? Therefore, in all that we do, we bring our personality with us, and it manifests in that which we do, specifically work here. I think you would also agree with me when I say that experience helps to mold personality and identity. So in an indirect sort of way, experience manifests in one's work relating to work output. And let me expand upon that a little bit more. I believe that experience with the glass ceiling, experience with gender discrimination in a purportedly meritocratic society can develop a kind of passion that only comes with experience with oppression, which then develops the kind of urgency, again, that comes with that experience. You know, you think to yourself, you have to do something about this. I know what other people are going through. I don't want it to continue into the future. And only upon having that sense of urgency can the kind of agency be brought about that is necessary to dispel with the disparities that exist in our society, the divisions, unfair divisions of labor, and move towards a better and more inclusive future. And given the deeply entrenched nature of gender stereotypes in our political and economic systems, given the fact that they are inextricably linked with the very moral fabric of our society, I believe that only a sense of urgency can bring about the kind of agency needed to impel broad-scale social change. So I very briefly here, I'd just like to supplement this by saying that I've covered, I think, top-down influence on the society, but I'd also like to consider bottom-up influence because the individuals in the political sphere mold the society, but individuals within that society can then socialize themselves to behave or conduct themselves or put themselves on a trajectory in accordance with those positions which they feel they are cut out for. Because of the divisions of labor, which they observe growing up. Now, again, gender discrimination, gender stereotypes are a factor, a major factor with respect to the unfair divisions of labor that exist, but the child doesn't know that growing up. This is really at the essence of social learning theory. It's a theory of socialization in social sciences. I'm a psychology major, so maybe this is my favorite part of this presentation. I don't know. I'll have to determine that after I'm done. But through that, it helps to reinforce the system which is put in place by those individuals in power who wish to maintain their structural power. It fortifies them. And over time, our society remains in a state of stagnation. Disparities persist, unfair divisions of labor remain, and we are still not at the inclusive sort of a future which should be allowed if we do in fact live in a meritocratic society. Now, in concluding these remarks, I would just like to say that I do hope I've been able to successfully diagnose the nature of the problem, because one of the central premises of the argument that I put before you is that in order to be able to move towards this better future, which I think many other people envision, we have to acknowledge that there exists a problem, like the alcoholic. The alcoholic must first acknowledge that they have a problem with alcohol in order to be taking steps towards addressing it, because why take any steps if there's no issue to address in the first place? Likewise, we have to acknowledge that there still exists a glass ceiling, which results in the systematic exclusion of people from spheres of influence, thereby preventing them from achieving self-actualization and not allowing our society the best chance of ensuring that it functions at a high level into the future. If we're to have a meritocracy, then let it be so. But if we're not to have one, then we should dispel with the fiction that we do indeed have one, because it's causing real harm to real people. It has throughout our history, and it is at present. We should not allow American exceptionalism and a kind of wishful thinking to cloud our judgment, render the nature of our American system unclear to us, and obfuscating its reality. I would just like to say to everybody who's maybe listening to this right now, or will be listening to this at a later date when it's recorded, that I do thank you very much for your time and attention. It's been an honor to have the opportunity to represent my school, Northampton Community College, at the Northeast Regional Honors Conference. I do believe it's something I'll remember for the rest of my life. And I would like to take a moment to express appreciation for Dr. Kara McClintock Walsh, my professor at Northampton Community College. Without her having advocated on my behalf and having expressed support for this endeavor of mine, I quite literally would not be here right now. So thank you, Professor. And to the other panelists, I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and I wish you the very best of luck. Thank you.
applause here. Yay. Well done. That was really great. I think, I think that you did a wonderful job with your presentation. We dimmed the lights so we could really see your slides. But there are people here. Wave, guys. Say hi. Say hey. So you have an audience. Does anyone have, we can take a quick question before we move on to Myazia.
More of a comment than a question.
Okay. Can you hear him?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I believe so, yes.
All right, I just want to say that you did a very good job speaking. I didn't hear you start once. Like you seem were well prepared for this presentation. So I just want to give you props on that.
You're like passionate about what
you're very passionate.
Thank you. That really means a lot to me to hear that. I do appreciate it. Thank you.
So, no, I think it was great. I think you were really well spoken, great examples. But I think what we can do as a group is we'll listen to our second presenter. So you can go ahead and share your screen. And then maybe at the end, we'll take a few minutes to maybe draw some connections and reflect on this panel. So well done. And let's move on to our second presenter.
Hi, everyone. So I decided to do a verbal presentation. So is everyone ready? Can you guys hear me perfectly fine? Okay, great. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Myazia Daye, and I'll be presenting my research on cultural variations between Americans and Japanese regarding the recognition of universal facial expressions. The goal of my research was to investigate the influence of culture on the facial recognition of emotions between American and Japanese individuals, and answering the question, is it possible that cultural differences between the United States and Japan have an impact on the way the 6 universal emotions are recognized? So with that said, by demonstrating how emotions are conveyed and various communal relationships can be restored and improved through communication skills and society. So individuals' ideas, attitudes, and conduct has a significant influence on the ability to express, perceive, and feel emotions. This is because culture establishes structural norms, expectations, and standards that assist people in grasping, interpreting a wide range of emotions. While it looks as if the capacity for perceiving and expressing facial emotions is universal, current studies indicate that this is not the case. Cultural conventions vary considerably when it comes to expressing one's emotions. Emotions are natural human feelings that pervade all facets of human life. Along with awareness and correspondence, they allow people to participate in various kinds of social cognition. As a result, emotions are key factors in influencing the great majority of human thoughts and actions. So to elaborate on emotions, it's a phrase that refers to a range of different emotional states, moods, and impacts. It is a subjective sensation that is often associated with both internal and external factors in a person's life. With that said, there are said to be 6 universal emotions that exist. So disgust, joy, contempt, fear, anger, and surprise. So now we move on to our environments. Our emotional environments experiences alter our sense of self, which evolves and so provides a degree of perception. Cognitive processes are intrinsically related to feelings, behaviors, and understandings as are nonverbal indications created. Feelings such as pride, failure, and achievement all contribute to the self-representation and help build our identities, which leads to Dorn's theory that emotions evolve as a mode of communication, that diverse facial movements known as expressions evolve to communicate varied mental states and prepare the body to respond in certain circumstances. So let's talk about how facial expressions are experienced, assessed, and expressed. Following our sense of self, emotions are divided into distinct roles. The functions may be broken down into 4 different categories: the individual, the dyadic pair, the group, and the cultural context. It is possible to learn that others' thoughts, ideas, and intentions via emotional interactions, according to theorists, work at a dyadic level. Different experiences and emotional expressions within a group help individuals negotiate the responsibilities and statuses that come with belonging to a certain group. A person's emotional state has a significant impact on the creation of their cultural identity. Emotional experiences and cultural influences shapes a person's ability to interact socially. So as a consequence, people from the same cultural background are most likely to display comparable emotional responses which when presented with similar circumstances. Therefore, a person's cultural values and objectives impact their responses to a given scenario. So to understand culture, there are various approaches on what's more important to look at when it comes to values. human behavior, especially emotional behavior, is something that is important to look at. So in terms of Japan and America, these are two contrasting civilizations by individualism and collectivism. Individualistic cultures are defined by people who value their autonomy, highly prioritize their desires and aspirations above those of the collective. Individualism and self-reliance are seen as virtues in this society, and individualism is stressed in this nation such as the United States, because people have more of an independent, self-constructive view of themselves and are reliant to a wider social framework. Overall, America's value system is predicted on the notion of individual autonomy and self-sufficiency. Whereas personal feelings and freedom of expression are seen as secondary in collectivist cultures, such as Japan, who place a high premium on interpersonal relationships and places a strong emphasis on the significance of groups, settings, and connections. Thus, Japan takes a more holistic view of attention, emphasizing the links between objects rather than the objects themselves. This is why individuals have a strong sense of community and distinguish themselves from the rest of society. A high level of conformity ensures that individuals are identified as connected to their groups, so that it allows the organization to function their needs and take priority of those of an individual citizen, meaning we work as a collective instead of one. So having said that, since these two cultures have a different view of self-perception, people express themselves and what they deem acceptable as an effect of how these cultures see emotions and facial expressions. So now various sensitivity and arousal levels are associated with various cultural backgrounds. So it impacts their overall perception and of the particular culture. Cultural sensitivity is the ability to culturally sensitize themselves to engage successfully with diverse backgrounds due to their awareness of cultural differences. So individuals who lack cultural awareness, on the other hand, think that all races, all religions, and all ethnic groups are the same and they all share one culture, which therefore leads to misinterpretation of a facial expression in connection with their emotions. So with that said, facial expressions may be deciphered using cultural clues, much like cultural context. Considering that different cultures place a different value on different things like emotions, it's likely that the way people interpret emotional expression will change. So for an example of how these opposing cultures view emotions and facial expressions, East Asian cultures are known for encouraging emotional equilibrium and self-control. In Japanese cultures, people rarely show their emotions via facial expressions such as smiling or frowning. This is because Japanese cultures emphasize the fact that in Japan, humility is regarded as the most admirable virtue to maintain their social standing. So most individuals put on a show of modesty so that they don't show their emotions, which causes them to not know how to interpret emotions outside, like when they go anywhere else. So whereas Americans believe that showing emotions indicates insincerity, therefore suppressing one's emotion is frowned upon. Emotional reactions are seen in the United States as a natural way of expressing their inner sentiments, which is why they express their emotions so outwardly. And in the US, people see emotions as purely personal and internal. So it's about showing their inner self. Therefore, the urge to express their emotions, they have the urge to express their emotions instead of suppressing them. So now we go on to my findings. It was shown that Japanese recognize females more readily than females because females and males in Japan have a different tolerance levels for emotional expressions. Research found that tolerance for emotional expression depends largely on a specific emotion type, but not valence. Whereas Japanese women were recognized to showing their emotions more because in their society, men are supposed to conform their emotions and they're supposed to be able to conduct themselves in society without showing a sense of weakness. Whereas Americans were able to identify emotions in 83% of facial photographs, and Europeans scored 75% more and 83%, whereas Japanese scored 65%. This research showed that evidence in racial in-groups effect was found in Americans, and European students are able to more accurately identify facial emotions because in this society, they just show more emotions. They're able to understand, they're able to use clues that are going on around them. And whereas in Japanese cultures, they believe in conformity. So it's harder to understand emotions outside of their culture. So in conclusion, this shows that the way individuals live their lives, beliefs, attitudes, and behavior can show how they express, perceive, and experience emotions. This is because when it comes to culture, it provides a structure, a norm, an expectation, and a standard that aids in individuals comprehending and interpreting a wide variety of emotions. So thank you guys for listening to my presentation, and I appreciate you guys having me. And this has been an amazing experience. And I also thank my mentor for guiding me in my research and making me test myself more and look into more things that I wouldn't normally look into. So thank you all for having me.
You can hear the applause. All right. So I think that this was a really interesting group of two presentations. You know, I will open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions or comments? And just use your teacher voice.
I just wish more people were able to hear both the presentations because they were both really good. I feel like they both deserved a bigger audience. So.
Well, I think having an audience of 6 here in person in Philly is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I do wish some of the more of the virtual ones came on, but I had a thought, you know, while you were talking, Myazia, I was thinking like about Daye's presentation and how could I make a connection between the two. So I was thinking about the whole virtual situation, right? So I'm curious, like, how you guys feel COVID and kind of being not in person has maybe impacted some of the dynamics explored in both of your projects. So to me, I wonder if, you know, being virtual maybe leveled the gender playing field in some ways, and thus kind of made everybody kind of a great equalizer in some ways. I wonder if you have thoughts about that, Daye. And then to you, Myazia, I was thinking, you know, with COVID, people's ability to really read facial expressions and body language and being able to communicate in those nonverbal ways that your research explored probably suffered as a result of COVID. So I'm just wondering if you guys want to comment on how virtual everything maybe impacted the dynamics of your projects.
Well, I suppose I'll go first. I'll try to make an attempt to answer that question. Professor, I do believe what you're saying is absolutely correct. It's certainly something I have to think about a little bit more, but in attempting to connect my thoughts to the other presentation, which is made before here today, from a psychological perspective, again, because I'm a psychology major, I think ultimately what this comes down to is attempting to develop an understanding for and of the experiences of individuals who may be different from us in some way. And I think a lot of that comes down to developing a sense of empathy. And based upon some of the conversations I've had with my psychology professors, it could be the case that the virtual modality could actually reduce a true empathy, at least as we experience it on a face-to-face level. Not quite to the extent that it could be if there was no video interaction here, but you know, the mirror neurons that are talked about in the brain are not being activated to the same extent. And if that is in fact the case, and if it is true that that results in reductions in empathy, it could be the case, the alternative, that there is less of an understanding between individuals who are different, which can perhaps result in more antagonism between the two groups. That's just my thought, maybe playing devil's advocate there a little bit, but I think that relates to the other presentation. At least I hope it does.
Okay, so when it comes to reading facial expressions and being on Zoom or virtual, it's kind of a bittersweet kind of moment because, you know, a lot of people, when they're in person, it's harder for them to communicate. It's harder for them to practice their social skills. But when we're online, it's also harder to recognize our facial expressions and interact effectively because we're only showing from here up. So we're not seeing our body movements. We're not seeing if someone's uncomfortable. We don't get to grasp that feeling that, okay, this person is feeling this way and we can read their body language and we can understand that right now they're uncomfortable or right now they're excited, you know? So, but then, you know, when it comes to Zoom, a lot of people are also more comfortable because they feel like they don't have the big crowd in front of them. So they don't have to, they're not as scared as they once were. I know when I was presenting, you probably all heard it, I'm like shaking and you can hear my voice. No, okay. Well, I was very nervous, but I feel like if I was in person, I would be more nervous. And then you guys would be able to read my body language, whether that be me tapping my leg, me twitching, or it's harder to read each other when we're virtually, but it also gives people more comfort being virtual, and then being able to, I guess you can say in a sense, conduct themselves to their environments or adjust more effectively or better. So and then also it goes to show, like, some people may also be intimidated, because then it goes back to my colleague's presentation, and it was talking about how gender, a lot of people may feel like they can be intimidated by another gender. So this kind of levels the playing field, in my opinion, because you're in the comfort of your own home also, so you don't have to worry about that. And then you also get to understand, like, we are the same, nothing's different between us. We're both speaking, we're both creating a wonderful presentation. So it's a good, and it's like a double-edged sword when it comes to like recognizing each other and recognizing facial expression. So hopefully I answered your question, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, no, it's just more of just gathering your thoughts. So thank you guys. Anyone else have anything they want to ask?
I do want to drop one through thread here, which is that Tay talked a lot about meritocracy, right? And this sort of American ideal of meritocracy. And his critique, I think, is well founded that we don't always achieve that. But I want to connect it to something that Maya mentioned, which is the difference between individualistic and collectivist cultures, right? And it's because Americans have a very individualistic culture that we value meritocracy. The whole point is like, it's me, it's what I've earned, and therefore I should get based on my own individual merits. So I think it's both important to realize that that's like a culturally specific value, that in a collectivist culture, meritocracy maybe doesn't actually make as much sense as it does in an individualistic culture. And I guess I would also just follow up with this with a question for Tay, which is, it sounds like you think meritocracy is an ideal to sort of strive towards, and that we're sort of failing that. But would you like to see a system that is, let's say we can find a purely meritocratic system, but one nevertheless that produces inequality? Is that a system that you would want to see? Because I mean, ostensibly people have different merit, different abilities that could produce inequalities. Is that something that we should be striving towards as a society?
Right, you're absolutely right there. I think you raise a absolutely fair point. Focusing specifically on disparities in outcome may not necessarily relate directly to inequality and opportunity. My interpretation of what you're saying is that I do understand, and that's absolutely a fair point. And I think it's probably, to have a purely meritocratic society is probably as fair a system as an American is going to have. And again, this comes from a second-year college student. I'm certainly perhaps not in a position to say that this is how it's going to be. This is just my opinion. I think the idea that with enough study, interest, consistent diligence, an individual is able to achieve upwards hierarchical progression, I think is a good thing and something to strive towards. And, to the point that it could be the case that, well, perhaps women aren't as interested in politics. That's a fair point. It's a fair counter argument to what I'm saying. But there is, and I'm not necessarily saying that you're making it, but there is an article that I would like to draw attention to. It's referred to as Cracking Gender Stereotypes, Challenges Women Political Leaders Face. And there's a couple of quotes here about, I'm quoting it verbatim, voters have limited time and energy to devote to political matters. Therefore, they rely on stereotypes to help them evaluate political leaders. Perhaps the typical voter may be somewhat ill-informed, and again, they may make their decisions regarding competence, again, on basis of what an individual is or appears to be rather than what they are capable of, their demonstrated level of competence. So I think we can have a meritocratic system, but I also think we can have one in which decisions regarding competence are being made purely on basis of one's demonstrated level of competence rather than, as I referred to in my presentation, archaic perceptions of competence formed on basis of broad generalizations. I'd like to think we can have that. Maybe that's wishful thinking on my part. I do hope that answers your question. I would like to see such a system, but one in which decisions are made purely on basis of an individual's aptitude. But thank you for the question. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And this side, anybody?
Good. That was a lot of big words. So
Well, I have no doubt that, once we get everything situated, these recordings will be uploaded and we'll send out links and instructions on how to access them. But again, I want to thank our two presenters, and let's give them one more big round of applause. And hopefully, so if you're a sophomore, what year are you, Maya?
Senior.
Senior, okay. So, maybe Tay, maybe next year we'll see you in person at NRHC if that's possible. But thank you guys so much for your presentations. Well done. And I'm going to stop the recording here.